A confessional's back panel gave beneath my fingertips like a loose floorboard, and 4 microcassettes slid into my palm, each labeled in a careful hand. Mora 1, Mora 2, Nolan Session, 3C, Final. The chapel was so still I could hear the candle wax cooling, and in that small hush I knew the orchard wasn't our only burial ground. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I keep the chapel key on a brass ring that's worn a circle into my pocket lining, and most mornings in winter I'm up before the boiler coughs awake. St. Agatha's sits 2 miles inland from the Pacific, where the wind carries salt and fir needles and makes the bell rope slap the stone like a wet rope against a dock. In January, a thin skim of ice forms on the birdbath, and the walk to the laundry shed shines slick as glass. We learned the hard way to spread sand along the flagstones by first light, or else the novices will break their necks before lauds. I've been here 32 years. The floors and I have grown old together. The convent grounds run a little over 8 acres, nothing grand. A chapel with a dark oak nave, a narrow library with ledgers that go back to 1961, a greenhouse that sweats even when it's 28 degrees outside a cemetery with rows of hand-poured crosses, and at the back property line, the orchard. The orchard's about 150 feet past the laundry shed beyond a sagging gate that snags its hinge in heavy weather. Once it gave us cider and jam, but rot and wind and time do what they like, and the trees went to thorns. When I walk the gravel path after vespers, I keep my eyes left away from the twisted branches the way you avoid a neighbor who once hurt your feelings and never said sorry. Before the break in our peace, my days moved in the same slow rhythm fire. The boiler light, the candles. Unlock the side door for the infirmary courier and pencil in the visitors' names with a steady hand. On Tuesdays, I aired the vestments. On Saturdays, I oiled the sacristy hinges so the door would close without a groan during Mass. The sisters teased me that I had a romance with routine. I told them routine was the closest thing we had to a good guard dog. Catherine Hale laughed the way a person does when the world is full of work she means to finish short, bright, already facing the next thing. She kept a thermos that dented in the same place every year near the seam and swore it held heat better for the bruise. She worked at the village infirmary 2 miles down the hill, a low building with a buzzing Coke machine and a donation jar that never filled past $10 because folks around here put cash where it's needed, not where it looks nice. In winter, Catherine wore a charcoal coat that came to mid-calf and kept a pair of wool socks in her pocket for anyone with cold feet in the waiting room. She could pull a splinter from a palm with the gentleness of a mother and the speed of a mechanic. Isabel Hart kept the quiet work. She had a knack for children who could not put their needs into words. The county sent them by the weak kids from trailer parks, tucked under the highway kids from fishing families upriver. Little ones who spoke in whispers, or not at all. Isabel kept simple tools, picture cards, a battered puppet with one eye, a jar of buttons to sort by color. When she listened, she tilted her head, as if the other person's voice were a bird she didn't want to startle. Her laugh was softer than Catherine's and slower to arrive, but when it did, the room felt warmer by 5 degrees. Mother Agnes Reed had been our steady wheel for 2 decades. Tall, spare a woman who could fold sheets with one snap and could make a decision without blinking. She kept her office neat as a ledger. 1 pen, 1 calendar, 1 glass paperweight with a tiny white dove trapped in it, floating forever in clear resin. On storm days, she walked the hallway with her hands behind her back, feeling the drafts in the plaster without needing to look. A woman of order, a keeper of boundaries. She called our little corner of Oregon a house of prayer, but I could hear the second word she never spoke, refuge. We had neighbors the way small towns do, by sound and smell as much as by sight. On still afternoons, I could pick up the sawmill miles away, its blade singing at the same pitch as our tea kettle when it's ready to pour. The coastal road muffled to a hush by the time it reached our lane. A few trucks heading east after dawn with crab pots tied high with rope. A pickup laden with split alder, a school bus that slowed just enough to bump the pothole at the bend. Mornington's sheriff drove a Ford with a door that stuck in cold snaps, and you could hear the thunk when he had to shoulder it open outside the diner. If the church bell rang at an odd hour, somebody's coffee cooled while they looked at their watch and guessed why. In that winter of '91, rain came sideways, then snow, then a thaw that turned the yard to a brown sponge. The greenhouse smelled like dirt warmed under a lamp, and the chapel soaked up the chill the way old stone does, slowly and completely. We wrapped the pew kneelers in blankets overnight so the first sisters to morning prayer wouldn't wince when the cold bit their bones. The radiators clanged sometimes just before they gave heat, and we learned to wait through the racket with patience and a foxed copy of Psalms. We keep our own stories here, little ordinary ones. Catherine liked to recite Tennyson while she dried plates, not the famous bits, but the quiet lines about winter light and simple mercy. Isabel put a drop of lavender oil on her wrist before Compline to settle her thoughts, and it carried into the prayer hall like a promise that sleep would come. Agnes kept an extra pair of reading glasses in the pocket of her cardigan, because she was forever misplacing the first pair in her sleeve. I kept the visitors' logs in a locked cabinet with the keys labeled by year, and every January the new ledger paper felt like a short road before anyone's feet had marked it. There was an afternoon, always the small things, when we were in the kitchen, 3 women and a pot of barley stew. The hour sat thick. The radio mumbled a weather report from Portland and lost the signal halfway through the wind advisory. Catherine reached for the salt and shook it once, then put it down untouched, as if her hand had changed its mind mid-air. She looked toward the east wing like she'd remembered something and then didn't say what it was. Isabel noticed and didn't press. Agnes came to the doorway and asked who had left the side gate unlatched by the laundry shed. The gate had banged all night in the wind, and none of us had heard it. That's how it goes. The hinge knocks, and you sleep right through. There's a corner of the library where the visitor logs from 70 through 99 sit together, worn spines, neat dates, patient signatures. They're nothing special to most people, names, parishes, reasons for coming, but I have a habit of running my finger down a line when I dust the way a person might trace the map they walk every day. Some names survive longer in the air than others. A priest whose vowels carried Boston into every sentence. A visiting bishop with a handshake that made my rings pinch. A girl whose last name the pen chewed into before the writer corrected it. You don't notice how the threads tug until something else snags them. On clear days, the Pacific threw a bar of silver down the horizon, and we could see it from the east window if we leaned left and squinted past the elm. The air smelled like cold pennies, and the crows hacked at the apple skeletons like men cutting rope. The cemetery looked newly combed after a snowfall, our little iron crosses standing at attention, the names softened by ice. I like to think the sisters who came before us listened in those hours, the way you can hear a house breathe when the furnace cuts off. The convent is old enough to remember what we forget. Catherine wrote notes the way nurses do square tidy a dot over every eye. She kept her appointments on a paper calendar tacked to the pantry wall near the clock, and if she had to shift a visit, she slid the note to the next open square with a straight pin. Isabel taped kids' drawings to the icebox houses with 2 small windows and sunflowers taller than the roof and stick people with long fingers. Agnes kept a red pencil for underlining budget lines in the ledger and a black one for concerns. My job among the pots and keys and books was to notice what changed an inch at a time. The town counted on our predictability. The mailman left the bundle for the infirmary on our bench if he was running late, because he knew the ladies would walk down by 11. Mrs. Yancey from the diner called us every other Thursday to ask if we needed eggs at cost. Her boy's seat had squeaked on the old orphanage pews years ago, and she said bargains were a way to pay back what couldn't be counted. Sheriff's deputies drove slow past our lane when the high tide chewed up the shoulder and left driftwood where it shouldn't be. Predictable is only boring until you need it. The first faint crack, nothing loud, was the kitchen clock. It lost 5 minutes in a week. The second was a water stain the size of a quarter above the confessional's back panel, where a roof nail had loosened in an east wind. The third came on a Wednesday, the kind of winter morning that starts in gray and never earns its light. Catherine's coat hung by the door next to Isabel's scarf, both speckled with snowmelt. The thermos, clean as a bell, sat on the counter with a fresh tea bag resting beside it, instead of inside where it belonged. I placed the tea bag back into the tin and told myself they'd fill the thermos in the infirmary because the kettle was quicker there. A small story to soothe a small worry. Late afternoons, we kept a lamp on the sideboard that threw a warm oval onto the pantry wall. The glow always looked like a hearth we moved from room to room by plugging and unplugging. We made toast too dark, talked about the price of milk in town, compared notes on the boiler's tantrums. I took down the visitor's ledger as the sun fell, drew my lines across the day, and logged who had come through our door. The postman, a woman bringing a bag of second-hand sweaters, a county clerk dropping off a notice. I signed my initials at the bottom right like I always did. I have never liked leaving blanks. There's a sound the sea makes when the wind turns south, a long pull like someone gathering rope hand over hand. It changes the way the cypresses move and makes the chapel windows rattle in their frames even when the doors are latched. That evening the wind shifted while I was sweeping the sacristy and the crucifix shadow climbed an inch up the wall. I set the broom back in its corner and stood there listening. The boiler cycled. Somewhere a hinge complained. The chapel breathed out a long old breath. Nothing else. After supper, Isabel sorted buttons for a project and lined them on a dish towel like small moons. Catherine pressed the dent in her thermos with her thumb and said it was time to tug the socks box from the shelf by the back door because the cold was seeping under the infirmary's threshold. Agnes pinned a note about an upcoming diocesan call to her corkboard and smoothed the paper with 2 fingers until it lay flat. I rinsed the stew pot and stacked the bowls 3 deep to dry on a folded dishcloth. The radio caught a song from 1973 and then lost it in a hiss. I switched it off. Night settled in pieces. Porch light on. Back door bolted. Library shade drawn. I set the chapel key on the saucer by my cot next to the brass ring that makes a circle in my pocket. The air had that particular cold that bites the tips of your ears first, and I pulled the blanket high and felt the straw of the mattress rustle under my shoulder blades. Someone coughed in the east hall. The greenhouse heater ticked. We keep a simple practice in winter, a porch light left on until the last sister has returned to her room, and then I make one last pass down the hall just to set my eyes on every closed door. That night I took my lamp and walked the length of the corridor. The boards creaked in the same places they always do. A draft eased through the wainscot near the corner where the plaster doesn't hold. The clock by the pantry had lost another minute. I lifted the shade and peered into the yard. Snow sifted in the glow beyond the glass, a fine curtain more ash than flakes. The porch light hummed and cast an amber circle onto the steps. Down the hill toward town, a single pair of headlights carved the dark and then disappeared around the bend without turning up our lane. I watched a breath longer than I needed to, waiting for a second set to follow. The phone on the kitchen wall did not ring. The porch light kept burning, and the thermos standing upright on the counter cooled by the inch. The night held its breath longer than usual. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded around a mug that had gone cold, staring at the porch light through the frost on the window. It had burned all night, same as always, a soft amber circle in the dark. But that night it felt less like a habit and more like a question waiting for an answer. When dawn came, the snow on the steps was unbroken, no boot prints, no return. By morning, prayers the others had noticed too. 2 coats missing from the rack, 1 scarf, and the thermos gone from the counter. I told myself they'd left early for the infirmary, maybe stopped in town for supplies. Catherine was the sort to do that, organized but impulsive in small ways. If she saw the need, she met it no matter the hour. Isabel followed wherever compassion called her. But by midday, when the courier came for the medical parcel and found no one waiting, a quiet unease began to thread through every room. By dusk, it had turned to worry. The path they took was short, 1.5 miles downhill, a stretch of gravel road, a narrow bridge, then the village. Familiar ground. Even with snow, they should have been back by noon. Mother Agnes called the postmaster first, then the infirmary, then the train station in Clonbridge. Each call came back the same: no sightings, no visits logged, no one matching their description. The sheriff sent a constable, a young man with a heavy coat and the cautious politeness people use around nuns. He asked when we'd last seen them, what they were wearing, if they'd taken anything unusual. He wrote it all down and promised to check the road before nightfall. I walked him to the door, thanked him, and watched his taillights disappear into the white haze beyond the gate. The air smelled of iron, that sharp scent snow carries when it's about to deepen. Inside, the convent felt thinner without their voices. The sisters sat around the table long after supper, murmuring prayers, cups of tea going cold in their hands. Agnes paced the hall, rosary slipping through her fingers without sound. I found myself at the window again, the same spot as the night before. The porch light flickered once, twice, then steadied. I tried to pray but could only whisper their names. The words felt heavier than the air. By the second day, the sheriff's car appeared at the gate. He said they'd found nothing. No footprints beyond the road, no sign of a fall, no broken branches. He mentioned the storm might have swept away tracks. His voice carried the tone of someone trying to soothe without lying outright. When he left, he promised to return with a volunteer search team. He didn't. The county had a flood warning that week and resources stretched thin. Agnes said the church would handle its own inquiries. That phrase, its own inquiries, didn't sit right with me, though I didn't know why. That evening, I went to their room. The door was ajar, the air faintly scented with lavender oil, Isabel's touch. Their beds were still made perfectly smoothed, not a wrinkle. Catherine's Bible lay open to a psalm about refuge. Isabel's small wooden cross rested at an angle on the nightstand. A book of poetry lay nearby, one of Catherine's favorites, Tennyson, Break, Break, Break. When I sat on the edge of the bed, something crackled beneath my hand. A folded piece of paper tucked under the pillow. I hesitated before opening it, as if it might change something by being read. The handwriting was Isabel's, delicate, uncertain. The note said Catherine wanted to speak to someone again, someone she believed forgiveness might still reach. Isabel disagreed. The last line caught my breath. If something happens to us, please look in the orchard. Something should never have been buried. I read it 3 times slower, each time the ink seeming to darken with each word. The orchard, of all places. No one had tended that ground in years. We'd let it rot rather than tear out the roots. But Isabel's warning felt deliberate, not poetic. I folded the note and slipped it into my sleeve. Agnes needed to see it. She listened quietly as I read it aloud, her face unreadable in the low light of her office. When I finished, she pressed her fingers together and said only, "You know how stories grow in old houses?" I told her this wasn't a story. She looked out the window toward the dark outline of the orchard beyond the wall. "We'll pray," she said, "and we'll wait." I didn't wait. That afternoon, when the others gathered in the chapel, I walked the back path alone. The snow muffled everything, even the sound of my own steps. The orchard was a gray tangle, branches bent low under the weight of ice. The trees looked more like bones than trunks. The ground was uneven patches of black soil breaking through the white. I stopped near the oldest tree, the one split by lightning years ago. The bark was charred in a streak that ran from base to branch tip, like a scar that never healed. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed a patch near the roots where the snow looked different, pressed down, uneven. Someone had been there recently, kneeling, maybe digging. I brushed away the top layer with my glove. The earth underneath was soft, not frozen, freshly disturbed. My chest tightened. I pulled a ribbon from my veil, tied it around the nearest branch. The color looked too bright against the gray wood, like blood on frost. I couldn't dig alone. Not yet. But I marked it. Back inside, I washed my hands, though there was no dirt on them. The water ran cold. When I looked up from the basin, Agnes stood in the doorway. She didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't tell her. Her silence wasn't ignorance. It was protection for the convent, for herself, maybe even for me. That night I couldn't sleep. The storm had cleared, and the moonlight fell pale and sharp across the chapel floor. I lit a candle and sat at my desk, the note beside me. My thoughts kept circling back to that name him. Whoever he was, Catherine and Isabel had gone to meet him. Agnes's reaction told me she knew more than she wanted to admit, and deep in my memory, something stirred a whisper from years before when the orphanage still stood behind the convent walls. There had been talk of a visiting priest once, Father Nolan. I hadn't seen him myself, but his name appeared in the visitor logs several times in 1989. After that, nothing. The orphanage had closed soon after. One of the girls, Maura, had gone missing. The record said she'd been transferred to care in Portland, but no one ever saw her again. By morning, I was in the library. The room smelled of dust and old paper, the air colder than the hallway. I pulled the visitor logs from the shelf year by year until I found the right span. The entries were meticulous signatures, reasons for visits, times of arrival. March 1989. Father Thomas Nolan. April, same. October again. After that, his name vanished. My fingers traced the ink until it smudged faintly. A memory surfaced, the whispered gossip between novices, something about a girl being sent away. I dismissed it then. We were taught to silence rumor the way we silence temptation quickly, without giving it room to grow. But looking at that name in that familiar, precise handwriting, I felt the old stillness crack. When Agnes came to find me, I was still at the table, the ledger open. "You're up early," she said, voice level but watching. I told her I'd been checking records, that I'd found Father Nolan's entries. She looked at me a long time before answering. "That name hasn't been spoken here in years," she said. "He was assigned briefly during renovations at St. Bridget's. He helped with confessions, the orphanage, before it closed." Her tone carried something I hadn't heard before, fear wrapped in authority. "Do you think Catherine and Isabel went to him?" I asked. She hesitated. "Catherine believed justice had been delayed," she said. "But she also believed in mercy. You know how conviction can lead even the purest astray." Her words chilled me more than the wind outside. Conviction astray. It was the kind of phrase people used when they wanted to make wrong sound holy. I looked down at the ledger again, at the dates, the spacing between them. "Maybe it's time we looked at what we've left buried," I said. Agnes's eyes flicked to mine, tired, hard, frightened. "Be careful, sister," she whispered. "We survive by knowing what not to dig." That evening I sat by the window and watched the light fade from the orchard. The blue ribbon I'd tied there fluttered faintly in the dusk. I imagined Catherine and Isabel walking that same path days ago, their coats buttoned to the throat boots, crunching over the snow. Catherine would have been the one to speak first, Isabel trailing close behind her, hand at her sleeve, twisting the fabric when she was anxious. I pictured them pausing at the tree, looking down at the ground I'd touched and realizing something terrible waited there. I pressed the note flat on my desk, placed my rosary beside it, and whispered their names again. The convent's walls seemed to listen, every sound wind through the eaves, the slow creak of settling wood blending into one long, low murmur. For the first time in all my years, there the silence didn't feel sacred. It felt complicit. The next morning I took off my veil before leaving my room. My hair streaked with gray caught the cold air like a small shock of freedom. I slipped the note and the visitor log into my satchel and stepped quietly down the hall. No one stopped me. The chapel bell rang for prime as I passed the window, its echo folding into the distance. When I reached the orchard gate, frost glinted on the latch. The ribbon still marked the spot, waving gently as if beckoning. I knelt beside it, spade in hand, and touched the soil again. It gave under my palms, soft, recent, alive with something that shouldn't be. Behind me, the convent bell rang once more. Not for prayer this time, but for time itself moving on, whether we were ready or not. I pressed the first edge of the spade into the ground and felt the earth sigh open beneath it. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was just about two missing sisters. It was about everything this place had kept quiet for decades. And I think deep down I already knew what the soil would give back. The sound of metal against earth is one you don't forget. It's dull, almost hollow, like a heartbeat muffled through a wall. That's what I heard that night, the faint thud of my spade striking wood beneath the soil. The wind moved through the orchard in long, cold breaths, and my candle flickered where I'd wedged it into the snow. I remember kneeling, brushing the dirt away with my bare hands until I could feel the grain of a small wooden box. It wasn't large, no bigger than a loaf of bread, corners softened by rot, a single latch rusted shut. My breath came shallow. For a long moment I just sat there, the cold biting through my skirt, the trees leaning in like witnesses. Then I opened it. Inside was a bundle tied with fraying twine, a rosary with beads missing, 2 photographs curled at the edges, and a stack of medical papers stamped with a name I hadn't spoken in decades. Maura Delaney. There was also a cassette wrapped in tissue, the words, "Do not destroy," written in a shaky hand. My pulse stuttered when I saw the signature at the bottom of one of the letters. Catherine's. Her words were brief, written in the kind of hurry that comes when you know you might not have time to finish. She wrote that Maura was real, that Father Nolan had come back, and that she and Isabel had confronted him. She ended with a line that felt like a confession. We thought we were careful. We were wrong. I couldn't stay out there after that. My fingers were numb, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. It was from fear. I closed the box, covered the disturbed earth as best I could, and carried it back inside, wrapping it in my cloak. Every sound in the hallway felt louder than usual. The click of my boots, the creak of old wood, the hum of the boiler through the walls. In my room, I laid the box on my desk like an unwanted gift. For a long time, I just stared at it. I didn't dare open the cassette. I didn't even own a player. But I knew where one was, down in the infirmary storage among the old therapy equipment Isabel had once used with the mute children. That thought hit me harder than I expected. She had spent years helping those who couldn't speak, and now she was gone, leaving me a voice she must have wanted heard. When the halls fell silent and the candles in the chapel burned low, I went to the infirmary. The key hung behind the cabinet near the stairs. It was an old skeleton key, heavy enough to feel like it carried responsibility. The lock turned with a dry click. Inside the room smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and lavender. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight. On the shelf by the window sat the cassette player, gray plastic handle cracked but still working. I set it on the desk, slid the tape in, and pressed play. At first there was nothing but static, a faint crackle like rain on a tin roof. Then Catherine's voice, distant but unmistakable. "I don't know how much time we have left," she said. Her tone was calm, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "Isabel is frightened. She wants to go to the bishop, but I don't trust that path anymore. Nolan's return was no coincidence. He knew about Maura's letters. He knows what we found." A pause. "He's watching. Always watching." The tape went quiet for several seconds, and then softer. "I believe Miriam will find this. I pray she does. Please, if anything happens to us, go to the orchard and then go to the police. Don't let the church bury this again." I don't remember turning the player off. I only remember the silence afterward, the kind that isn't empty but thick with realization. They hadn't run away. They'd been silenced. I leaned back in the chair and let the cold sink through me. Outside, the wind had died. The night felt hollow, as if even nature had drawn back to listen. When dawn came, I was still awake. The light through the infirmary window turned the snow outside a pale gold, and I knew what I had to do next. The police wouldn't listen without proof, and the church, well, I already knew how far its reach could go. I needed someone who had looked for truth before and hadn't stopped when told to. I thought of Detective Carver, the man who'd investigated Maura's disappearance 30 years earlier. He'd been reassigned before he could finish, and I remembered hearing that it had never sat right with him. I found his number in an old Rolodex Agnes kept in the office. I stared at it for a long time before dialing. He answered on the second ring, his voice older but steady. "Carver. This is Sister Miriam Blackwell," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. "From St. Agatha's. I need to speak with you." There was a pause. Then quietly, "I've waited 30 years for this call." We arranged to meet the next morning, but that night something else happened, something I can still see when I close my eyes. I was sitting in the chapel waiting for the others to finish Compline when the door creaked open. A draft swept through cold enough to make the candles flicker. A man stepped inside, tall coat dusted with snow. He removed his hat slowly, and the air seemed to thicken around us. I knew that face. Older now, lined, but still wearing the same measured calm that once passed for piety. Father Thomas Nolan. He walked down the aisle as if he still belonged there. "Sister Miriam?" he said, voice smooth, practiced. "You remember me?" I stood without meaning to. How could I not? He smiled then, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I came to pray." "No," I said, my voice louder than I expected. "You came for something else." He tilted his head, that small priestly gesture meant to disarm. Still sharp, he murmured. We ended up outside in the cloister garden, sitting across from one another like two people who had both come to settle an old debt. His gloved hands rested on his knees. Mine were clenched in my lap. He said he'd heard about the missing sisters from a friend in the diocese, that he was simply here to offer comfort. I told him his comfort was the last thing this place needed. His smile faltered for the first time. "Why are you really here?" I asked. He leaned forward slightly. "Because I think you're starting to remember things that were meant to stay buried." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. "I never forgot," I said. "I just stopped pretending they didn't matter." He sighed as if I were a wayward child. "You don't understand what's at stake. This convent, your vows, your church." "Don't speak to me about vows," I said. "You broke yours when you touched that girl." For a moment I thought he might strike me. His expression hardened, the mask slipping just long enough for me to see the man underneath. Then it was gone. "You don't have proof," he said flatly. "I have enough." He rose, then brushed the snow from his coat. "You've always been a firebrand. That's why they kept you hidden. Not like Catherine, she knew how to play the long game. She played no game," I said. "She died trying to bring truth into the light." He turned away, the snow crunching under his boots. "You're making a mistake," he called over his shoulder. "I'm making a choice." When he disappeared around the corner, I realized I'd been shaking. It wasn't fear, it was fury. For years we'd built our lives on silence, mistaking it for faith. But faith without truth isn't holiness, it's rot. That night I locked my door and laid everything out on the desk. The box, the letters, the tape. I pressed play again, letting Catherine's voice fill the room. Her words ran deeper this time. "We went to him," she said. "We told him we had the files, that we wanted the church to open an inquiry." He laughed. Said no one would believe two nuns from a forgotten convent. Said we were ghosts in habits. But we left a trail, Isabel insisted. We hid copies of everything. If he comes back, you must not face him alone. I turned off the tape and sat in the quiet. I wasn't alone, not anymore. The trail they'd left now led straight through me. I picked up the phone again this time to confirm with Carver. He answered almost instantly. "Detective?" I said, "There's more than you know. I found proof, and I'm not the only one he hurt." His voice was low, steady. "Then we do this right. I'll come with a partner. You just hold on." For the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself in years: hope. Not peace, not yet, but the sense that truth once spoken might finally stay standing. Before I slept, I checked the window. The orchard lay still beneath a thin crust of ice, the ribbon I'd tied now stiff in the wind. Somewhere out there under that ground, Catherine and Isabel had faced him, and somewhere beyond the hill he was still walking free, convinced that what he'd done would remain hidden. But morning was coming, and this time someone was listening. The morning Carver arrived. The air was the kind that stings your lungs, bright cold and too quiet for what it carried. I met him at the gate just after sunrise, the orchard behind me still rimed with frost, the ground hard where I'd knelt nights earlier. He looked older than I remembered from years ago, lined face, shoulders squared but heavy with time. Another detective got out of the second car, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste words. Carver introduced her as Detective Aisha Boone. They'd come without fanfare, no flashing lights, no uniforms. Just two people with the kind of purpose you can't fake. I led them down the narrow path behind the shed. The trees groaned in the wind as if the orchard itself had been waiting. When we reached the spot I'd marked, the ribbon hung limp from the branch, stiff with ice. "Here," I said, and my voice caught on the word. The soil had shifted again, sagging slightly since I'd reburied what I'd found. Boone knelt first, brushing the surface with her glove. She didn't speak, just signaled for the team behind her. Within an hour, the hum of generators filled the air. Yellow tape ran between the trunks, and the stillness I'd lived with for years was gone. They dug carefully, methodical, as if the ground itself could bruise. When the first blanket appeared, a corner of gray wool matted with dirt. Boone crouched beside it, whispered something I couldn't hear, and looked at me before nodding to her team. The blanket came free slowly, the fabric unraveling in the cold. Beneath it lay a crucifix, tarnished but intact, resting over folded hands. Isabel. Even before they said her name, I knew by the ring she wore a plain band she'd kept from her mother's rosary. My knees gave way, and I felt the earth press back through my coat. Boone's hand found my shoulder, steady but gentle. "We'll confirm," she said, "but I think you already know." I nodded. The words wouldn't come. By late afternoon, they uncovered another blanket a few feet away. The same care, the same ritual of quiet hands and slow breathing. Catherine this time. She'd been laid close enough that if they'd been conscious, their fingers might have touched. The air felt thick with the weight of it, not horror exactly, but something deeper: recognition. Carver kept to the edge of the tape, taking notes, his pen moving steady and sure, the way men write when they've carried doubt for too long and finally see it breaking open. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the orchard turned the color of bruised fruit. Boone walked the perimeter, flashlight sweeping low. The others began to pack up when one of the techs called out a tone that stopped everyone. Something else deeper down. They worked again, quieter this time, and after another hour, the shovel struck something that wasn't wood, but bone. Small, fragile. The smell of turned soil mixed with decay, older than memory. When the last of it came clear, they found a child's bracelet, tarnished, one letter still visible. Maura D. Boone didn't have to say the name. It was the one we'd all been carrying since 1989. The orchard, for all its silence, had been holding its truth all along. Afterward, I walked a few paces away and sat at the base of a tree. My hands were still shaking, but my thoughts were strangely calm, as if the years of waiting had emptied me of surprise. Catherine and Isabel had found what I just unearthed, and it had cost them their lives. Boone came over, quietly crouched beside me. "They were buried with care," she said, eyes scanning the graves. Not like someone hiding a crime, like someone trying to bury a secret they couldn't live with. Her words hung in the air, fragile and terrible. "It was him," I said. "It was Nolan." She didn't argue. "We can't prove that yet," she said, "but the evidence you gave us, the box, the tapes, they'll reopen the case on Maura Delaney." Inside the convent, Mother Agnes sat in the common room, her teacup untouched, steam gone cold. Boone and Carver sat across from her while I stood near the doorway, not trusting myself to speak. The detectives asked simple questions, what she knew when she'd known it. At first, Agnes answered carefully the way people do when they're still weighing what truth will cost them. But as Boone pressed gently, the cracks began to show. Agnes admitted she'd known of Nolan's past concerns, her word not mine. She'd heard whispers about a girl at transfer that didn't make sense. She'd told herself the matter had been handled elsewhere, that the church would protect its own from scandal. I could see the weight of that lie sitting in her shoulders. "You let him come back," I said quietly. She didn't look at me. "You let Catherine and Isabel face him alone." Agnes's voice broke when she finally spoke. "There are times when silence feels like survival," I answered before I could stop myself. "And there are times when it becomes complicity." The next morning, the orchard was empty again, but its quiet was different, no longer secret, just hollow. The bodies had been taken for autopsy, the evidence tagged, the tape removed. What was left looked like a wound. I stood beside the place where Catherine had been found and whispered, "I found her. I found you both." The wind shifted through the branches, and for a moment it sounded like breath. I told myself it was enough, that after all these years they could finally rest. But a voice deep inside me said otherwise. Rest doesn't come until the living stop running from the truth. That truth now pointed toward one man. The bishop's office confirmed Nolan had been reassigned several times after Maura vanished. Quiet transfers, new parishes, new faces to fool. Carver said it was the same pattern he'd seen before in other cases, the same chain of denials dressed up as mercy. The diocese had called it relocation for health reasons. Boone called it what it was, protection. We drove to the diocesan headquarters 2 days later. The building rose gray and solemn against the drizzle windows shining like polished coins. Inside, everything smelled of wax and floor polish. The receptionist led us to a long corridor that felt colder with each step. Bishop Thorne was waiting in a conference room, his collar starched white, his expression practiced. "Detectives," he said, nodding, "and Sister Miriam. It's been decades." His tone was cordial, almost kind, but behind it was something calculating. I told him 3 women were dead, one of them a child, all tied to a priest he had reassigned. He folded his hands and said, "I've been told you've reopened an old investigation." Boone corrected him. "We've opened a new one, because this time we have evidence." Carver laid the photographs on the table. Catherine's grave, Isabel's, the child's bracelet. The bishop glanced at them briefly, then steepled his fingers. "I had no knowledge of these matters," he said evenly. I leaned forward. "But you knew about Nolan. You moved him from one parish to another. You knew about the complaint in '89 and the disappearance that followed." His gaze didn't waver. "There were rumors," he said. "No confirmed reports." Carver's pen tapped once against his notebook. "You didn't look for confirmation," he said. "You buried the truth." The bishop's voice hardened. "We protected the church. "You protected a predator," I said, and the words came out low, steady, final. The conversation ended with an address a retreat center in Montana where Nolan had been living under supervision. The bishop said it like it was a kindness, not a shield. Carver folded the paper, thanked him without meaning it, and stood. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. Boone looked at me and said, "We'll bring him in. It's almost over." I stared up at the cathedral spire, water dripping from the stone saints that lined its edges. "No," I said. "It's just beginning." Back at St. Agatha's, I lit a candle in the chapel. The flame trembled, catching the faint draft from the open door. I whispered the names, Mora, Isabel, Catherine, and watched the wax melt slow and patient down the side. For years, I'd believed the dead needed our prayers to find peace. That night, I realized it was the living who did. The orchard outside was quiet again, but I knew its silence wouldn't last. Somewhere in the mountains, the man who had buried them was still breathing, still telling himself he'd been forgiven. But forgiveness, I'd learned, has nothing to do with forgetting. When Boone called the next morning, her voice was firm. "We got the warrant. We're flying out tonight." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had led us here, the box, the tape, the graves, the years of silence. "Then go," I said. "And don't let him hide behind God again." The line went quiet for a moment. "We won't," she said. I hung up, and for the first time in decades, I felt something break loose inside me, a kind of stillness that wasn't fear or sorrow, but resolve. The kind that comes when the truth finally stands up after years of kneeling. The snow began again that night, soft at first, then heavier. By dawn, the orchard was white to its roots, the graves smoothed over as if the earth were trying to cover its own shame. I watched from the window until the light grew strong enough to see the faint shape of the ribbon still clinging to the tree. The color had faded, the fabric stiff, but it was still there, a marker in a world that had tried to erase what it couldn't face. That's when I knew we were done waiting. The next chapter wasn't for the dead anymore. It was for the living, and for what came next. Snow followed them into Montana, the kind that hangs in the air like ash, soft, slow, and impossible to outrun. I wasn't there when they knocked on his door, but I've imagined it 100 times. The retreat sat high in the foothills, old stone walls and pine shadows, the kind of place built for quiet men who had run out of places to hide. When Detectives Boone and Carver stepped inside, they found Father Thomas Nolan seated at a table with a fire going, hands folded as if waiting for a confession that would never come. He looked older than I remembered, but the stillness was the same calm, the same rehearsed humility that had fooled so many for so long. When they read him the charges, 3 counts of murder, multiple counts of assault, he didn't argue. He just nodded once, said he'd been expecting them. When they cuffed him, he asked if the church would protect him. Boone said no. I learned the details in pieces, the flight back to Oregon, the booking the press outside the courthouse. I didn't go to the first hearing. I'd spent years surrounded by silence. I didn't need to hear the sound of his voice again. But when the trial began that spring, I sat in the second row behind the prosecution rosary wound around my hand and listened. They played the tapes, the ones Catherine and Isabel had left the ones of Mora's voice trembling through static. The courtroom stayed so still that even the lights seemed to hum softer. I watched the jurors listen to those voices, to the little girl describing her fear to Catherine, begging whoever found her message to tell the truth. I watched Nolan stare straight ahead, face unreadable, as if the sound of their pain was something he'd heard too many times to feel. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with the same steady breath I used to light candles at dawn. The prosecutor asked how I'd found the box, how long I'd known what was buried beneath our orchard. I told them the truth. I told them I'd been afraid that I'd believed silence was loyalty, and that it had taken me 30 years to understand the difference between faith and obedience. I said their names, Mora, Isabel, Catherine. And for the first time in public, I spoke them without whispering. When I looked at the jury, some nodded, not out of pity, but in the way people do when something lands where it was meant to all along. Nolan never took the stand. His lawyer tried to speak of mental decline, of confusion, of spiritual delusion, but the journals the detectives had found at his retreat told another story. His handwriting changed over the years from rigid and neat to frantic and uneven, but the words carried the same sickness, love twisted into control, sin justified as mercy, the constant refrain that forgiveness requires sacrifice. The jury didn't deliberate long. When they returned, the foreman's voice was low and sure. Guilty on every count. I didn't cry. None of us did. There was only breath, the kind that feels like something heavy finally lifting off your chest, even if it leaves a mark. After the verdict, Boone found me in the hallway. She handed me a small envelope, the chain of custody note for the items recovered from the orchard. "You're listed as next of kin for the sisters," she said softly. I remember thinking how strange that word sounded, kin. But in a way that's what we'd become bound not by blood but by the choices that tied us to that ground. I thanked her and told her to keep a copy of the tapes sealed in evidence. "Let them rest," I said. The words are enough. The months that followed were slow and strange. Reporters came and went. The diocese issued statements full of regret, but short on accountability. The convent nearly closed. Some donors pulled support, others quietly increased theirs. In the end, St. Agatha's stayed open, but it didn't feel the same. Fewer sisters, more visitors. The orchard was cleared, the graves reinterred properly with headstones this time. The FBI team helped us place a small bronze plaque near the center of the grove. It reads, "In memory of Sisters Catherine Hale, Isabel Hart, and Mora Delaney." They were not lost. They were silenced. Now we remember. We held a small service that spring. The younger sisters read psalms. I said nothing. When the final hymn ended, I laid 3 white flowers at the base of the new tree we planted, and I remember thinking how the ground looked peaceful again, soft alive, ready to give something back. Agnes stood beside me, frailer than before, her face pale under the veil. She'd given a full statement to prosecutors months earlier, admitting what she'd ignored, what she'd feared. The church stripped her of her title, but allowed her to remain with us, a quiet mercy for an old woman carrying a lifetime of guilt. When the service ended, she turned to me and said, "It should have been me who went to the orchard." I told her we'd all been there one way or another. Over the next year, I started what we came to call Testament Hour. It began as a small gathering in the library every Wednesday evening. No robes, no rituals, just space. Women came from nearby parishes, from shelters, even from town. Some had their own stories of silence, some just came to listen. We'd light a candle and speak names of sisters, daughters, friends, anyone the world had tried to forget. The first night only 4 of us sat in that circle. By the end of the year there were 12. Sometimes I still felt the ache of what we lost, but seeing those faces strong, weathered, alive, reminded me that healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering out loud. 6 months after the trial, Boone called. Her voice was lighter this time. She said the state had denied Nolan's appeals, that he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. I thanked her and asked if he'd said anything when the decision came down. She paused before answering. "He asked for his rosary," she said. "That's all." I pictured him sitting in that cell, beads passing through the same hands that had destroyed so much. For years I thought I wanted to see him repent, to hear him speak some kind of apology. But now I understood that some men confess only to themselves, and sometimes even God stops listening. That summer, the orchard bloomed earlier than usual. The trees that once stood as witnesses now filled with white blossoms, petals soft as paper drifting down like snow. We opened the gates for the first time in years, invited families from town to walk through. Children ran between the rows, their laughter breaking through the stillness that had hung there for decades. It wasn't a holy sound, it was a living one. I stood under the new tree, its trunk slender but steady, and felt a kind of peace I hadn't known since before that winter morning when they vanished. People sometimes ask if I ever forgave him. I tell them forgiveness isn't a door you open, it's a house you choose to leave standing even after you've walked away. What I learned is simpler. Justice doesn't undo what's been done, but it keeps the truth from disappearing. And sometimes that's the most any of us can hope for. The church moved on as it always does, reshaping its story around what could be tolerated. But the town of Mornington changed. The locals planted flowers along the old trail to the infirmary. The children at the parish school now learn about the 3 women who lived in service and died in courage. Their names are written on a plaque by the front gate. I visit sometimes not as a nun, but as Miriam, just a woman who stayed long enough to see silence break open. It's been almost 2 years since the verdict. The convent is smaller now, quieter, but full of new voices. We host workshops for survivors, open to anyone who wants to speak or simply sit in the company of people who understand. Some nights I walk out to the orchard alone, the air heavy with the scent of apples. I look up through the branches and think of the ones we lost, not just the 3 we found, but the many who never got to be heard. I still keep Catherine's photo on my desk, the one where she's squinting against the sun, Isabel's hand on her shoulder. Maura's drawing a rough cross made of twigs and blue ribbon hangs beside it. They're reminders that courage doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like persistence, like patience, like a hand digging through frozen ground, because something inside you refuses to let the story stay buried. When I think of them now, I don't picture the orchard the way we found it. I picture it the way it is today, light moving through the leaves, wind carrying the scent of new fruit soil, rich with roots that no longer hide anything. I think that's what healing looks like, the same ground, but honest this time. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because memory, when spoken aloud, is the only kind of resurrection we're allowed in this world.